Sterling Tower's marble lobby gleamed like a cathedral built for profit rather than prayer. The morning sun slanted through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across polished stone that cost more per square foot than most Americans earned in a month. At 6 in the morning, the building should have been empty except for security and cleaning crews. Instead, 5 executives in tailored suits stood in a loose semicircle around the base of a towering, abstract sculpture. Steel and glass twisted into something that might have been a DNA helix or simply expensive chaos. They weren't looking at the art. "Step back, she'll bite." Jim Porter's voice carried the rough authority of 20 years in the Marine Corps, followed by another decade watching rich people pretend their buildings were fortresses. His hands shot out, palm flat, stopping Ethan Cross mid-stride. The mop handle felt suddenly heavy, a weapon Ethan didn't want to use. At the center of the chaos, a small girl with hair the color of winter wheat sat curled on the floor. Her knees pressed against her chest, arms locked around her shins, body rocking in a rhythm that belonged to no music anyone else could hear. 7 years old, maybe 8, wearing a blue dress that probably cost what Ethan made in a week scrubbing floors. Her face held a blankness that wasn't peace, it was absence, like someone had carefully erased her from the inside out. But her eyes, Christ, her eyes darted like trapped sparrows looking for a window that didn't exist. One of the executives, a woman with smartphone pressed to her ear like it might save her, whispered urgent instructions into the void. "She's having another episode. Where's her nanny? I don't care if she's stuck in traffic. Get her here now." The girl's humming rose and fell, nearly drowned by the building's ambient silence. That particular silence that came from too much money and too little life. Ethan had been cleaning these floors for 2 years. He knew the difference between quiet and emptiness. "May I?" Porter's arm remained extended, a barrier between Ethan and whatever liability the suits feared. "That's the Sterling girl." The name came out like a warning label on industrial chemicals. "Don't get involved. Last guy who tried got fired on the spot. Building manager doesn't want complications." Ethan wasn't listening, not to the security protocols, not to the threat of unemployment, not to the camera mounted in the corner, recording everything in crisp digital clarity for lawyers who'd never set foot in this lobby. He was watching her, the way her fingers tapped the floor, 3 quick beats, pause, 2 slower ones. The way her breathing quickened every time a shoe clicked too close against marble. The way her whole body telegraphed a message everyone was too busy to read. "I'm not going to talk to her. I'm just going to sit." He did exactly that. Right there on the cold stone floor, still wearing his dark blue janitor's uniform with Sterling Tower stitched over the pocket, still smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and honest sweat. 5 feet away from the girl, close enough to matter, far enough to breathe. The executives exchanged glances that said everything about their understanding of children like her. None at all. Ethan reached into his cleaning cart, the same battered gray cart he'd pushed through these halls 1,000 times, and retrieved a small plastic bottle of dish soap, the generic kind that came in bulk from suppliers who didn't waste money on branding. Then he dipped his fingers into the water bucket attached to his mop, feeling the lukewarm liquid coat his calloused hands, and began to blow bubbles. 1, 2, 3. The girl stopped rocking. Not immediately, not like a switch flipped or a spell broken, but gradually the way dawn erases darkness, so slowly you don't notice until suddenly you can see. Her motion decelerated like a train remembering brakes. The humming softened from distress to something closer to curiosity. She watched, transfixed as iridescent spheres floated upward, catching light, throwing tiny rainbows against the steel sculpture. Some popped instantly, victims of their own fragility. Others drifted lazily toward the vaulted ceiling, like secrets refusing to land. Ethan kept his eyes forward. Didn't look at her directly, didn't ask questions or make demands or try to fix anything. Just kept blowing bubbles into the expensive air of Sterling Tower's lobby, one deliberate breath at a time. From the mezzanine overlooking the scene, a woman stood motionless in tailored heels that added 3 inches to her already commanding height. Slate gray coat that probably came from Milan, cut to emphasize power rather than curves. Blonde hair wound into a bun so tight it looked painful, pulled back from a face that magazines called striking and employees called terrifying. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Biotech, had commanded boardrooms full of venture capitalists and crushed hostile takeovers before her second cup of coffee. She'd built a $3 billion pharmaceutical empire from her father's struggling research lab, earned a reputation for brilliance laced with ice, and made Forbes' list of most powerful women 3 years running. None of that mattered right now. Right now, watching a janitor calm her daughter with soap bubbles, she could barely breathe. Her hands gripped the glass railing hard enough to hurt. 7 years of specialists, 2 years of silence. Therapists from Sweden and behaviorists from Stanford and developmental pediatricians who charge more per hour than most people earned in a day. Tens of thousands spent, hundreds of hours invested, and a janitor with dish soap accomplished what they couldn't. Eva, her daughter, her mystery, her burden. The little girl who'd stopped speaking at age 5 and hadn't uttered a word since, who flinched at unexpected sounds and recoiled from certain textures and lived in a world the rest of them could only guess at. And the janitor, what was his name? She'd seen him before, of course. You didn't run a company from a building without noticing the people who kept it functioning. Hale, Cross, something working class and forgettable. Victoria moved toward the elevator with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd long ago stopped asking permission. The doors opened instantly, responding to her executive key card like everything else in this building, eventually bent to her will. When she stepped into the lobby, the executives parted reflexively. They knew that walk, knew the expression that meant someone was about to receive clarity they didn't want. Mr. Cross. Ethan stood slowly, leaving the bubble bottle on the floor where the girl could see it. An offering, not an abandonment. Ma'am, I'd like to speak with you. Upstairs. Now. His gaze flicked to the girl, Eva, he'd heard someone call her, who now lay on her side completely still, except for her eyes tracking a single bubble as it hovered just above her face. The executives were already pulling out phones, probably calling the nanny, the doctor, the lawyers, covering their asses. I wasn't asking. Victoria turned, heels clicking a staccato rhythm against marble, not waiting to see if he followed. He did because people like her didn't make requests. They issued instructions and expected compliance. Behind them, Porter radioed someone. Get Dr. Sharma down here and tell building management we need the security footage from the last 15 minutes. The elevator rose in silence. 37 floors passed in 45 seconds. When the doors opened directly into Victoria's office suite, Ethan stepped into a space that made the lobby look modest. Windows on 3 sides, Manhattan's skyline spread out like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. Furniture that probably cost more than his car. Art that he couldn't identify but knew was expensive because nothing in this room wasn't. Shut the door. He obeyed, feeling the soft click of the lock like a trap springing. Victoria didn't sit, didn't offer him a seat, just stood behind her desk, black glass and chrome angles, and studied him the way scientists study specimens under microscopes, looking for weaknesses, cataloging vulnerabilities. Who taught you that? Straight to interrogation. No pleasantries. He could respect that, at least. She wasn't pretending this was anything other than what it was, a woman at the end of her rope grasping at the frayed strands. My daughter. Her expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Your daughter. She has sensory processing disorder. I used to teach special education. Before. He let the sentence die there unfinished. She hadn't asked for his life story. Victoria leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. The motion brought her into the light, streaming through the windows, highlighting the fine lines around her eyes that makeup almost hid. Signs of strain, of nights without sleep, of a burden she carried alone because delegating wasn't the same as sharing. Let me be clear, my daughter does not engage. She does not play. She does not respond. Not to doctors with decades of experience. Not to specialists who've written textbooks on childhood development. Not to me. Her voice cracked on that last word, just slightly, a hairline fracture in the ice. And you? You blew some bubbles, and she went silent. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Sometimes silence communicated more than words. He'd learned that teaching children who lived in worlds without language. I want you to work with her. Victoria straightened, composure reestablished like armor hastily repaired. Once a week, twice if possible. I'll compensate you accordingly. I'm a janitor, Miss Sterling. I can change that. I don't need charity. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a job. He took a slow breath, feeling his ribs expand against the polyester uniform that never quite fit right. Cheap fabric for cheap labor. What she needs isn't a job. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Not guilt, that would have been too human. Grief maybe, sharpened into steel and pointed at the world. She has the best care money can buy. Defensive. The tone of someone who'd made that argument to herself countless times. Maybe that's the problem. The words hung in the air between them like bubbles waiting to pop. Victoria's jaw tightened. Her fingers curled into fists against the glass desk. For a moment, Ethan wondered if he'd just talked himself out of a job he didn't even want. Then she spoke, each word carefully measured. If I say yes, if I agree to this, what would you need? One condition. I don't work for you. I work with Eva. And when I'm with her, no observers, no cameras, no clipboard psychologists lurking in corners, taking notes. Victoria studied him long enough that Ethan felt his shirt sticking to his back with nervous sweat. The AC in here was probably set to perfect, but anxiety had its own climate. I'll have my assistant contact you. He turned toward the door, hand on the handle, ready to escape back to the world of mop buckets and floor wax where expectations were clear and nobody's daughter's future hung in the balance. Mr. Cross? He paused, looked back. Victoria stood silhouetted against Manhattan's skyline, a woman who'd conquered everything except the one thing that mattered. What color were those bubbles? Strange question. But he answered anyway. Blue, always start with blue. It calms the chaos. The drive home took 40 minutes through morning traffic that never really eased in this city. Ethan's 15-year-old Honda wheezed through intersections, burning oil, making promises about breaking down that it hadn't kept yet. Sophie sat in the passenger seat doing homework on her lap, pencil-scratching equations that seemed too advanced for 9 years old. But she'd always been ahead, always watching, learning, absorbing lessons that weren't being taught. Was that the quiet girl? Sophie asked without looking up from her math. Yeah. Did she talk to you? No. Did she want to? Ethan glanced at his daughter. Dark hair like her mother's, eyes that saw too much, a seriousness that came from losing someone at an age when loss shouldn't be possible. 4 years old when Sarah died. Old enough to remember fragments. Young enough that the memories were already becoming mythology. I think she's trying to figure out if it's safe. Sophie nodded, erasing something, recalculating. Mom used to say people only talk when they trust the silence first. The words hit Ethan square in the chest. Sarah's voice echoing through Sophie, wisdom passed down like genetic code. He swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. Your mom was right about a lot of things. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable quiet. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, in a neighborhood where people still knew their neighbors' names. 2 bedrooms, kitchen smaller than Victoria Sterling's office bathroom. Living room where the couch doubled as Ethan's bed because Sophie needed her own space to grow. Rent was 2/3 of his paycheck. Utilities took most of the rest. What remained went to Sophie's school supplies and the savings account he pretended was for emergencies, but really was for college. That night, after Sophie fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, worn smooth from years of love, Ethan sat on the couch and let himself remember. Sarah in the hospital bed, skin pale as winter, hair gone from the chemotherapy that promised hope and delivered only more loss. 11 months from diagnosis to death, aggressive cancer that laughed at treatment. She'd been 31, he'd been 30, Sophie had been 4. Don't raise your voice. Sarah's words whispered in the darkness of that final night when they both knew there wouldn't be another morning. Lower your body. He'd thought she was delirious, pain medication and morphine painting strange landscapes in her dying mind. But she'd gripped his hand with strength that shouldn't have existed in fingers that thin. With Sophie, when she's upset, when she's scared, don't stand over her and tell her it's okay. Get down on her level. Let her see you're not bigger than the fear. I don't know how to do this without you. You do, you just haven't learned it yet. A smile that cost her everything to produce. Promise me you'll teach her breathing, blue breathing, For when the world gets too loud. Blue breathing? Slow, steady, like the ocean she's never seen. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. Tell her Blue is calm, Blue is safe, Blue is coming home. Ethan had promised, had held her hand through those final hours when promises were the only currency that mattered, had watched the monitors go flat and felt something essential break inside himself that no doctor could repair. He'd quit teaching 2 months later. Couldn't stand in front of classrooms full of children who needed patience and wisdom when he had neither left to give. Every child's struggle reminded him of Sophie's grief. Every parent's worry reflected his own inadequacy. He'd failed the most important person in his world. What right did he have to help anyone else's children? So he'd taken a job cleaning floors. Simple work. Honest work. Work that didn't require him to fail anyone but himself. Until today. Until a little girl who couldn't speak taught him something he'd forgotten. Sometimes the most therapeutic thing you can do is stay. Victoria's assistant called the next afternoon. Grace Chen, mid-30s, voice professionally warm, but with an undertone that suggested she knew exactly how ridiculous this situation was. CEO's daughter, building janitor. Appointments that made no sense to anyone reviewing the calendar. Ms. Sterling would like you to visit tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock, the penthouse suite. Security will have your name. I'll bring my daughter. A pause. Grace probably hadn't expected that complication. Ms. Sterling didn't mention, she's part of what I do. If that's a problem, I can't help. Another pause, longer this time. Ethan heard typing in the background. I'll confirm with Ms. Sterling, one moment. The hold music was classical. Probably cost money to license. Everything in Victoria Sterling's world had a price tag. Mr. Cross was boss. Sterling says that's acceptable. 6 o'clock tomorrow. Don't be late. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of Sterling Tower. Private elevator required a key card that Grace provided via courier. The card arrived in a manila envelope with instructions printed in fonts that suggested lawyers had reviewed every word. Sophie wore her good dress, navy blue with white flowers that Sarah had bought 2 years before she died. Too short now, showing knobby knees, but Sophie refused to get rid of it. Some things mattered more than fit. Are we really going to see where rich people live? Sophie asked in the elevator, watching the floor numbers climb. We're going to see where one girl lives who happens to be rich. Is that different? I hope so. The elevator opened directly into a foyer larger than their entire apartment. Marble floors, different marble than the lobby, something with gold veins running through white, gleamed under recessed lighting that probably cost more than his car. Walls so white they hurt to look at. Modern art that might have been actual art or might have been someone's tax write-off. Ethan couldn't tell the difference. Everything arranged with the kind of precision that suggested an interior designer had been paid substantial money to make it look like nobody actually lived here. Victoria appeared from somewhere deeper in the penthouse. She'd changed from the power suit into slacks and a simple blouse, barefoot on the cold marble. That small detail, bare feet, made her seem momentarily human. Mr. Cross, you brought your daughter. This is Sophie. Sophie, this is Miss Sterling. Sophie performed a small curtsy that no one had taught her, but somehow she'd absorbed from watching too many princess movies. Nice to meet you, ma'am. Victoria's expression softened fractionally. Your father says you are very perceptive. He says I notice things. That will be useful. She led them through the penthouse. Open floor plan, vaulted ceilings, windows everywhere offering views that probably added $1 million to the property value. Kitchen with appliances that looked unused. Living room furniture that looked uncomfortable. Everything clean and cold and expensive. I don't need you to fix her. Victoria stopped walking, turned to face Ethan with those ice chip eyes that had probably made executives reconsider their career choices. Excuse me? Your daughter. You said that yesterday, but I don't think you believed it. So I'm saying it now. I don't fix children. They're not broken. Victoria blinked, just once. But in that single movement, Ethan saw the crack in her armor widen slightly. She's in her room. Through the hall, second door on the left. Ethan crouched down to Sophie's level, aware of Victoria watching the interaction with the intensity of someone taking mental notes. You okay to draw for a bit? Sophie nodded, already pulling her crayon roll from the small backpack she'd brought. Is she nice, the quiet girl? I think so, but she might need time to show you. Then I'll be quiet too. Sophie tiptoed toward the corner of the vast living room like she was entering a library made of clouds. Victoria's voice came soft enough that Ethan almost didn't hear it. She's very kind. She's had to be. He didn't elaborate. Didn't explain that Sophie's kindness came from the same place his patience did. Necessity carved from loss. When your mother dies before you're old enough to understand permanence, you learn early that gentleness matters more than rules. Ava's room was a palace designed by someone who'd never met a child. White walls, white curtains, white furniture. Toys lined up on shelves with military precision, dolls that had never been played with, books that showed no spine creases, puzzles still in shrink wrap, a bed big enough for 3 adults, covered in a duvet so perfectly smooth it looked like display model. And in the corner, curled against the window like a question mark made flesh, sat Eva Sterling. 7 years old, blonde hair so light it was almost translucent, cut in a bob that made her face look smaller than it already was. Gray eyes that should have been pretty, but instead looked haunted. Navy blue dress, bare feet tucked underneath her body, pressed against the window pane, watching the city 37 floors below, like she was memorizing an escape route. Ethan didn't speak, didn't approach, didn't do any of the things well-meaning adults reflexively did around children. He sat down slowly about 10 feet away, back against the opposite wall, and pulled a small notepad from his jacket pocket. He began to draw. Simple lines. 5 strokes for a house, a circle for the sun, 3 triangles for trees. Stars scattered across the sky with no particular constellation in mind. Eva didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence, just kept her forehead pressed to the glass, breathing, creating small fog circles that appeared and disappeared in rhythm. 3 minutes passed. Ethan had counted seconds in classrooms enough to know exactly how long 3 minutes felt when you were doing nothing but existing. He held up the sketch slightly, then set it on the floor between them. Not close to her, not keeping it for himself, just there. Available. An invitation requiring nothing. Nothing happened, just the sound of a clock somewhere in the penthouse ticking too loudly for a place this expensive. You'd think they could afford quiet clocks. Then movement, small and bird-like. Eva rose from her spot at the window with the careful deliberation of someone navigating a minefield. Crossed the room in steps that barely made sound, picked up the paper with fingers that trembled slightly, looked at it, looked at Ethan, sat down right next to him. Not touching, but close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something expensive and floral that probably came in bottles designed by French aesthetes. Through the door, slightly ajar, Victoria stood frozen. One hand pressed against her mouth, the other gripping the doorframe hard enough to show white knuckles. Ethan saw her shoulders shake once, quickly suppressed. He'd seen parents cry before. Usually when they realized their child wasn't broken, just living in a world that didn't speak their language. Ethan began a new sketch. This time a bubble floating above a girl's head. Simple, recognizable, connected to the one experience they shared. Eva reached for a crayon from a box on the floor nearby. Blue. Of course, blue. She didn't look at him, didn't speak, just began adding color to his black and white lines. 15 minutes later, Ethan emerged from Eva's room to find Victoria waiting in the hallway. Arms crossed but defensive posture abandoned in favor of something that looked like wonder mixed with desperation. She drew with you. Ethan nodded. She started the conversation. Victoria's brow furrowed, creating small lines that her morning skincare routine probably cost hundreds to minimize. She didn't say a word. Talking and communicating are not always the same thing. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked into the kitchen, an industrial space full of stainless steel and granite that probably saw less cooking than most food trucks. She poured water into a crystal glass, hands steady despite whatever emotion was happening beneath the CEO mask. Would you like something to drink? Water's fine. She poured a second glass, set it on the counter between them. The marble felt cool under Ethan's work-roughened hands when he picked it up. Everything in this place was cool, Temperature-controlled comfort engineered to perfection. I don't know how to reach her. Victoria said it quietly, like admitting failure was a foreign language she was trying to pronounce. Ethan didn't pick up the water immediately. Let the statement hang there unresolved. Have you tried letting her reach you? Her posture stiffened, back straight, shoulders squared. Battle stations. I've done everything a mother can do. Therapy, nutrition specialists, sleep studies, speech pathologists. A bitter laugh. I flew in a behavioral therapist from Sweden who charges $30,000 per week. Ethan finally picked up the glass, took a slow sip. The water tasted like it had been filtered through diamonds. Sounds like you've hired a lot of people to talk to her. But who listens? I listen. Sharp, defensive. I've rearranged my entire life for her. Did you rearrange your heart? The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was hollow, the echo of a question she'd probably asked herself at 3 in the morning when the board meetings were over and the quarterly reports were filed and all that remained was a daughter who wouldn't speak and a mother who didn't know how to hear. Victoria set down her glass with the careful control of someone afraid they might throw it. She was 2 when she stopped talking. The words came out flat, recitation of facts to ward off emotion. Ethan recognized the technique. He'd done the same thing explaining Sarah's cancer to relatives who needed details because details were safer than grief. One day she was babbling, saying colors, giggling at birds outside the window. Victoria stared at something beyond the kitchen, maybe seeing a child who no longer existed. The next day, nothing, not even eye contact, like someone flipped a switch and turned off the lights. What happened? Her eyes flickered with something between guilt and rage. Medical reaction. Vaccine schedule triggered a high fever. The doctor said it was coincidence, not causation. But I kept asking. Her voice caught. Was it my fault? Did I miss something? Did I cause this? Ethan leaned against the counter, feeling the sharp edge press into his back. Parents always do, even when it's not theirs to carry. Sophie wandered in holding a drawing. 3 people standing under a sky full of stars that looked more like flowers, but the intent was clear. She approached Victoria without fear, which said something about Victoria that maybe she didn't see in herself. I made this for her, but only if she wants it. I don't want to make her uncomfortable. Victoria looked down at the small girl offering artwork with crayon-stained fingers, and something cracked in her expression. That's very thoughtful. Mom used to say kindness costs nothing but means everything. Sophie said it matter-of-factly, the way children repeat wisdom they don't fully understand but know is important. Ethan felt the familiar ache in his chest, Sarah's voice through Sophie's mouth, legacy transmitted through chromosomes and memory. Victoria knelt down to Sophie's level, actually knelt, expensive slacks touching marble floor, and accepted the drawing like it was a contract worth billions. Your mother was very wise. She died when I was little, but Dad says she's still teaching us. For the first time since Ethan had met her, Victoria Sterling's composure shattered. Not dramatically, just a brief flash of raw grief recognizing itself in someone else's loss. She blinked rapidly, stood, smoothed her slacks. Would it be all right if Eva joined us for dinner sometime? Here, I mean, safe, familiar. If she sees Sophie eating, she might feel invited. The shift in topic was abrupt, but Ethan had learned not to push when people were teetering on emotional edges. When? Next Friday, 6 o'clock? Sophie looked up at her father with eyes that asked the question her mouth didn't need to. He nodded. We'll be here. As they prepared to leave, Victoria walked them to the elevator. Private, direct, no stopping on other floors to let corporate drones board with their briefcases and regrets. Mr. Cross? She waited until the elevator doors were open, until Sophie had stepped inside and was examining the polished brass buttons like they might reveal secrets. Thank you. He nodded. Words felt insufficient for whatever had happened in the last hour. Sometimes acknowledgement was enough. She doesn't eat lobster, by the way. Eva, if you were wondering what to serve. Ethan smiled slightly. Neither do we. The doors closed on Victoria standing alone in that vast marble foyer, surrounded by art and emptiness, wealth that couldn't buy the one thing she needed. On the drive home, Sophie asked the question she'd been holding since they left. Is she very sad? Who, Eva? Her mom. Ethan navigated through traffic that never really stopped in this city, brake lights stretching to the horizon. Yeah, Bug, I think she is. Because her daughter can't talk? Because she doesn't know if her daughter wants to. Sophie processed this with the seriousness she brought to everything. That's worse. Not knowing is always worse than knowing. Another echo of Sarah. She'd said almost exactly that in the hospital, talking about test results and prognoses. Not knowing was worse than bad news because imagination filled the void with monsters. You're very smart for 9. You're very patient for old. I'm 35. That's what I said, old. He laughed and Sophie giggled. And for a moment, the weight of Victoria Sterling's penthouse and Eva's silence lifted enough to remember that joy still existed in small spaces. The week passed in the rhythm of routine. Ethan worked his night shifts, cleaning floors and bathrooms and break rooms at Sterling Tower. Sophie went to school, came home to do homework supervised by Mrs. Chen from downstairs, who charged reasonable rates and kept emergency snacks. They ate dinners that came from cans and boxes, but were made with attention. They watched shows together, read books, existed in the comfortable poverty of people who knew exactly how much money they had and how far it would stretch. On Wednesday, Grace Chen called again. Ms. Sterling wanted to confirm Friday's dinner. 6 o'clock. Security has you on the permanent list now. Permanent? Her instructions. You're to have building access anytime you need it. That felt significant, like crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Ethan had learned to recognize moments when life changed direction. This was one of them. Friday arrived with the kind of autumn weather that made people forget winter was coming. Sophie wore her flower dress again, paired with a cardigan that was getting too small in the sleeves. They brought nothing because what do you bring to a penthouse? Wine felt presumptuous. Flowers felt like courting. So they brought themselves, which would have to be enough. Victoria answered the door wearing jeans and a sweater, actual casual clothes, hair down, falling past her shoulders in waves that softened the sharp angles of her face. She looked younger, or maybe just less armored. You're exactly on time. Former teacher. Punctuality was survival. She smiled slightly, actually smiled. Come in. I made dinner. The dining room had been transformed. The long executive table was gone, replaced by a round one that seated 4 comfortably. The overhead lighting was dimmed, replaced by candles that cast warm shadows. The cold perfection had been disrupted by warmth. Eva sat at the table already, hands folded in her lap, a blue crayon tucked between 2 fingers like a talisman. She wore a blue dress, of course. When she saw Sophie, something flickered in her eyes. Not quite recognition, but something closer to interest. Sophie slid into the seat next to Eva without hesitation, pulling her small backpack around to dig inside. I brought something. She produced a hand-drawn menu, each item illustrated with cartoon characters. Smiling grapes, dancing toast, a macaroni sun that looked like it had been rendered by Picasso's optimistic nephew. Ava's lips curved upward, small, brief, but unmistakable. Victoria watched from the doorway like witnessing a miracle that science couldn't explain. Her hand went to her throat, pressing against the pulse point like she needed to verify her heart was still beating. Dinner was simple, pasta with butter and parmesan, steamed broccoli cut into small trees. Bread that looked homemade, probably ordered from a bakery that charged by the artisanal adjective. Everything soft, nothing with strong smells, plated carefully. For the first few minutes, only silverware on china broke the silence. Sophie ate without talking, which probably took superhuman effort for a 9-year-old. Ethan followed her lead. Victoria picked at her food, too nervous to actually consume calories. Eva stared at her plate like it might attack. Then Sophie spoke, voice gentle. My dad says you're learning colors. I'm learning fractions. Fractions are weird because half of something can be bigger than a whole of something else if the somethings are different sizes. Eva's hand moved slowly toward a piece of bread, picked it up, looked at it, set it back down. Like half of a pizza is way better than a whole apple, even though whole sounds like more. Sophie took a small bite of pasta, chewed, swallowed. But I guess it depends on if you like pizza or apples more. Eva picked up the bread again, held it closer to her face, smelled it. Still no commitment. Ethan met Victoria's eyes across the table, shook his head fractionally. Don't intervene. Don't push. Let this happen at Eva's speed. I like pizza better, Sophie continued conversationally, addressing her plate more than Eva. But Dad says apples are healthier, so we have pizza only on Fridays and apples every day. Eva brought the bread to her mouth, took the smallest possible bite, chewed like she was solving a mathematical proof, swallowed. Victoria's fork clattered against her plate. The sound made Eva flinch, bread dropping back to the table. Sorry, I'm sorry. Victoria's voice cracked. I didn't mean... Ethan stood, moved to Victoria's side, placed a hand on her shoulder, felt her trembling beneath the cashmere sweater that probably cost more than his monthly rent. It's okay. She's choosing this moment. She's choosing this company. He spoke softly but clearly, making sure Eva could hear. She's choosing stillness. Sophie picked up her own bread, took a deliberate bite. Food tastes better with friends anyway. Eva looked at Sophie, really looked for the first time. Then slowly, carefully, picked up the bread again and took a second bite. Victoria pressed her hand over her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. Ethan squeezed her shoulder once, then returned to his seat. Sometimes victories looked like breadcrumbs. Sometimes that was enough. They finished the meal in comfortable quiet. Eva ate 3 bites of bread and 2 pieces of broccoli. Not much, but more than she'd eaten voluntarily in days, according to the notes Dr. Sharma had been keeping. Afterward, they moved to the living room. Sophie produced a small Bluetooth speaker from her backpack, dollar store special that worked better than it had any right to, and played soft piano music. Debussy, because Ethan remembered reading somewhere that complex music helped children with sensory issues process auditory input better than simple melodies. Sophie settled on the floor with paper and crayons, patting the spot next to her in invitation. Eva hesitated, then lowered herself down carefully, maintaining exactly 18 inches of distance. They drew in parallel, Sophie creating a garden with flowers that had faces, Eva working on something that might have been abstract art or might have been the way the world looked through her eyes, all angles and specific colors arranged in patterns that made sense to her alone. Blue first, Ethan said quietly, placing a blue crayon closer to Eva than anyone else. Always blue first. Eva stopped drawing, looked at the crayon, looked at Ethan, then placed her hand on it, claiming it with the solemnity of someone accepting a sacred charge. Victoria stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching her daughter engage with the world in ways she'd thought were lost forever. Ethan joined her, maintaining the appropriate distance of someone who was technically hired help, but felt more like co-conspirator. This is what safety looks like. His voice barely above whisper. It doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with stillness. Why doesn't she talk to me? The question came out raw, stripped of the CEO polish. Just a mother's grief in 4 syllables. Because you don't sit on the floor. Victoria turned to face him, confusion and hurt warring in her expression. What? Every time she sees you, you're standing, looking down. Even when you're trying to help, you're towering. Your body language says, I'm in charge, even when your heart doesn't mean it. Ethan gestured towards Sophie and Eva. Look at them, same height, same level. Nobody's above anybody else. I'm her mother, I'm supposed to be in charge. Of her safety, yeah. Of her choices, no. Victoria looked back at the girls, really looked. Saw Sophie deliberately staying low, movements casual but careful. Saw Eva's shoulders relaxing incrementally, the stiffness leaving her spine vertebra by vertebra. I don't know how to not be in control. Then learn, that's what she needs. Not someone who knows everything, but someone willing to know nothing and sit with her anyway. An hour passed. Eva didn't speak, but she accepted a grape from Sophie's hand. She allowed Ethan to sit within 3 feet of her. She drew 3 stick figures, one with glasses, one with curly hair, one with a tight bun, and colored them with deliberate care. When Sophie pointed at the figures, naming them, that's me, that's Daddy, that's your mom, Eva didn't confirm or deny, just colored the third figure's dress bright red. Victoria's breath caught. That used to be my favorite color. Eva paused. Her whole body went still, crayon hovering over paper. Then in the quietest voice imaginable, barely more than breath shaped into meaning, still is. Victoria's knees gave out. She sank onto the edge of the couch, hand pressed to her mouth, entire body shaking with sobs she'd probably been holding back for 2 years. Not elegant crying, not the kind you could do in board meetings or press conferences, the kind that came from somewhere primal and irreparable. Ethan didn't move toward her. Sometimes grief needed space to exist before comfort could land. He watched Sophie lean closer to Eva, not touching, but present. Watched Eva draw a small heart in red crayon next to her mother's figure. When Victoria finally regained composure, mascara smeared, face blotchy, looking more human than she probably had in years, she whispered, "She spoke. She hasn't spoken in 2 years, and she spoke." She remembered, Ethan corrected gently. There's a difference. She didn't lose the words. She just needed a reason to use them. Later, after Sophie and Eva had drawn until the paper was covered in color and story, after Eva had yawned 3 times and Victoria had gently guided her to bed without resistance, Ethan and Victoria stood in the hallway folding the blanket they'd spread on the floor. "You think I've been doing this wrong?" Not a question. Statement seeking confirmation. "I think you've been doing this the way someone taught you. Control, manage, solve." He folded his edge, met her halfway to complete the rectangle. But some things can't be solved. They can only be witnessed. "I've spent millions on specialists. Maybe what she needs costs nothing." Victoria handed him his jacket, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact lasted half a second, but carried weight neither acknowledged. "Next Friday, same time?" "We'll be here." She walked him to the elevator, Sophie already inside humming the Debussy piece they'd played earlier. "Mr. Cross, Ethan." His first name felt strange in her mouth, like she was trying on informal language that didn't quite fit yet. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't." The elevator doors began to close. Ethan caught them, held them open. "Ms. Sterling, Victoria, your daughter isn't broken. Neither are you. You both just forgot how to speak the same language." The doors closed. The elevator descended. Sophie leaned against his side, eyes already half closed with exhaustion. "She's gonna be okay, right? Eva?" "Yeah, Bug, I think she is." "Because we're helping?" "Because we're staying." The elevator reached the ground floor. Jim Porter nodded at them from his security desk, respecting the gesture that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. Outside, the city pulsed with Friday night energy, people seeking connection in bars and restaurants and whatever other places loneliness drove them. Ethan and Sophie walked to their car through air that smelled like autumn and exhaust and possibility. Somewhere 37 floors above them, Victoria Sterling stood at her window watching the city lights, maybe understanding for the first time that wealth couldn't buy what her daughter needed. And in her room, Eva Sterling lay in bed clutching a blue crayon, having spoken 2 words that changed everything. In the shadows across the street, a man sat in a black sedan with tinted windows. Camera with a long lens rested on his lap. He'd been taking pictures all evening. The janitor arriving with his daughter, the lights in the penthouse, the silhouettes visible through windows that cost more than most people's houses. He pulled out his phone, typed a message to a contact saved only as MW. "You were right. She's compromised. I'll handle it." Hit send, started the engine, pulled away from Sterling Tower, leaving nothing but tire marks on expensive asphalt and problems that hadn't arrived yet but were already metastasizing in the dark. 3 weeks became routine. Friday evenings at the penthouse, Sophie and Eva drawing while Debussy played through cheap speakers. Tuesday afternoons when Ethan's shift ended early, sneaking up the private elevator with Grace Chen's complicit scheduling. Eva's progress measured not in words but in willingness. Accepting touch from Sophie's hand, eating voluntarily, drawing figures that included herself in the family constellation. Then Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that precedes disaster. Ethan's access card blinked red at the employee entrance. Not the yellow flash that meant temporary malfunction. Red meant deliberate denial, someone making decisions about who belonged inside Sterling Tower's climate-controlled walls. Jim Porter met him at the security desk, military posture unable to hide discomfort. "Orders from management. You're restricted to ground floor maintenance only. No elevator access above lobby level. Since when? Since this morning. Email came through at 4 a.m. Porter slid a printed memo across the desk. Official letterhead, legal language, the kind of communication that meant lawyers had been involved. I'm sorry, Cross, this isn't my call. Ethan scanned the document. Words like security protocol and unauthorized access and personnel review, decorated sentences designed to obscure rather than clarify. His phone buzzed before he could formulate a response. Victoria's text arrived in fragments, urgency breaking through her usual polished communication. I didn't authorize this. Finding out who did. Don't leave the building. The answer arrived 40 minutes later in the form of Marcus Webb emerging from the executive elevators with a man Ethan didn't recognize. Mid-40s, expensive suit that somehow looked cheaper than Victoria's casual wear. Smile engineered for cameras and shareholders rather than human connection. Porter's radio crackled. Send Cross to conference room B. The room occupied prime real estate on the 15th floor, glass walls offering views that reminded everyone how high they'd climbed and how far they could fall. Marcus sat at the head of the table, silver hair and Rolex watch broadcasting the kind of authority that came from decades of making other people's problems disappear. The stranger took the seat beside him, arranging papers with the precision of someone who believed organization was character. Mr. Cross, thank you for coming. Marcus gestured to a chair like this was optional rather than summons. This is Gregory Hammond, our Director of Corporate Communications. Gregory's handshake felt calculated, applying exactly enough pressure to establish dominance without seeming aggressive. We've heard interesting things about your work with Ms. Sterling's daughter. Ethan sat, recognizing interrogation postures from years teaching students whose parents blamed everyone except mirrors. Eva's making progress. That's part of what concerns us. Gregory opened a folder, photographs spilling across the table. Ethan entering the building with Sophie. Victoria greeting them at the penthouse entrance. Images captured through windows, showing dinner scenes, drawing sessions, moments that should have been private rendered into evidence. Where did you get these? Security footage. Publicly visible areas. Gregory's tone suggested this was perfectly reasonable rather than invasive surveillance. The board has concerns about optics. A janitor with unlimited access to the CEO's private residence. A child in potentially vulnerable situations. Questions are being asked by shareholders who control significant equity. Marcus leaned forward, playing good cop to Gregory's corporate enforcer. Nobody doubts your intentions, Ethan, but perception matters in our world. Ms. Sterling is under tremendous scrutiny. Her judgment is being questioned. This relationship, professional or otherwise, creates complications we can't ignore. Eva is speaking again. Ethan kept his voice level, refusing the trap of defensiveness. 2 weeks ago, she said her first words in 2 years. Last Friday, she told Sophie that blue means safe. You want to explain to her why safe is suddenly complicated? We want, Gregory interjected smoothly, to protect everyone involved, including you. Take a voluntary leave. Let the media interest cool. When circumstances improve, we can revisit your arrangement. Translation clear enough. Disappear until the problem solved itself or forgot to matter. And if I refuse? Marcus's expression hardened fractionally, mask slipping to reveal the calculation beneath. We'd prefer cooperation, but building security is non-negotiable. Your access has been limited for Ms. Sterling's protection as much as yours. The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like threats and assurances that sounded like warnings. Ethan returned to the lobby where Porter waited with the expression of someone forced to enforce orders he disagreed with. You're a good man, Cross. This is politics, not justice. Politics always thinks it's justice until someone keeps score. That evening, Victoria appeared at Ethan's apartment door, looking more disheveled than he'd thought possible. Hair loose, minimal makeup, wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than his security deposit, but signaled she'd stopped caring about armor. Sophie answered the knock, eyes widening at finding a billionaire CEO on their third-floor landing. Miss Victoria, is Eva okay? She's asking for you both. She won't eat, won't draw, just sits by the window. Victoria's composure cracked like ice under pressure. I didn't authorize your access restrictions. I didn't know until Grace told me this afternoon. Ethan guided them inside, acutely aware of the apartment's shabbiness through Victoria's probable perception. Furniture from thrift stores, carpet stained by previous tenants' mistakes, kitchen where cabinets didn't quite close, and the refrigerator hummed threats about dying soon. But it was clean, always clean. Some standards mattered more than aesthetics. Who made the decision? Marcus, with board approval. They're threatening to remove me from CEO position if I don't stabilize my personal situation. She spat the corporate euphemism like poison. Gregory Hammond has been feeding stories to financial journalists, anonymous sources questioning my judgment, suggesting I'm having some kind of breakdown. Sophie appeared with tea, instant, made in their one surviving good mug. Victoria accepted it with the kind of grace that suggested she understood the offering's value beyond the beverage. They think I'm the problem. Ethan understood the equation. Janitor plus CEO equals scandal. Remove the janitor, restore the balance. You're the solution they can't explain to shareholders. Victoria's hands trembled around the mug. So they're reframing you as the threat. Over the next 2 weeks, they developed a system. Grace Chen scheduling maintenance emergencies that required Ethan's specific expertise. Jim Porter developing selective blindness when the private service elevator carried unauthorized passengers. Victoria's assistant creating meeting blocks that coincidentally aligned with times when the penthouse needed to be empty, except for a 7-year-old girl who'd learned that some visitors were worth the risk. The sessions continued in borrowed time and stolen access. Eva progressing slowly but measurably, speaking in colors when words felt too heavy, allowing Sophie to sit close enough that their shoulders touched, drawing families that included 4 people instead of isolated figures. But Sophie was paying the price. Homework completed in car back seats during hurried drives across the city. Dinner from fast food bags because cooking required time they no longer had. Friends from school becoming distant memories because playdates conflicted with covert visits to penthouses. One night, Ethan found Sophie drawing alone at their kitchen table. The picture showed 3 people, herself, him, and Eva. But Sophie's figure was translucent, barely outlined, like she was fading from her own story. Bug, we need to talk about this. I'm fine, Dad. Eva needs us more. The use of Eva's real name, the one Sophie used in private, made it worse somehow. Personal investment, eroding boundaries that should have protected a 9-year-old from adult complications. You're allowed to need things too. Sophie's crayon paused mid-stroke. Mom died when I was little. I don't remember her being sick, just being gone. You don't forget people who stay. Sarah's wisdom filtered through a child who'd learned survival meant invisible suffering. Ethan pulled Sophie close, feeling her small body rigid with the effort of being mature enough to handle what shouldn't be her burden. The custody papers arrived via courier on a Thursday afternoon. Thick envelope, law firm's return address embossed in letters that screamed expense. Inside, legal documents transforming Victoria's worst fear into actionable litigation. Dominic Sterling, petitioner. Emergency custody modification. Allegations spanning pages. Emotional instability. Exposure to unvetted individuals. Rejection of professional medical protocols. Creating an unsafe environment through involvement with uncredentialed personnel of questionable background and motivation. Every word precisely calibrated to weaponize Victoria's attempts at helping her daughter. Ethan arrived at the penthouse that evening to find Victoria on the floor surrounded by papers, expensive rug forgotten beneath the weight of impending loss. She looked up with eyes that had cried themselves dry. No tears left, just the hollow aftermath. He left when she was 3, 4 years of silence. Not a birthday card, not a phone call. Now suddenly he wants custody. What does he really want? Victoria's laugh held no humor. My father's trust fund, $50 million releases when Eva turns 8, but only to the parent providing a stable family environment. Her birthday is in 6 weeks. Dominic gets custody, he gets the money. The mathematics of greed disguised as paternal concern. Ethan sat down on the floor beside Victoria, ignoring propriety because sometimes shared devastation mattered more than hierarchy. Tell me about him. She did. Hedge fund manager before the 2008 collapse destroyed portfolios and reputations. Never recovered. pride preventing him from accepting Victoria's financial success, marriage ending in mutual recrimination and separate lives. Eva's diagnosis coming after the divorce, giving Dominic the excuse he'd been looking for to disappear without admitting he was running. I hired an investigator. Dominic has undiagnosed ADHD. College psychiatric records show visits to student health services. He told a therapist he couldn't handle Eva's meltdowns. Said he felt like he was making her worse. Victoria's voice softened despite herself. He didn't abandon us because he didn't care. He ran because he was terrified he'd damage her more by staying. Complexity where cartoon villainy would be simpler. Ethan understood that particular fear. He'd run from teaching for similar reasons. Sometimes courage looked like staying. Sometimes it looked like leaving. Usually it looked like neither, but felt like failure regardless. The private investigator's report revealed more. Dominic broke, liquidating assets to pay debts. His lawyer working on contingency, probably betting on the trust fund providing ample compensation. But also, therapy sessions continuing monthly, Dominic still wrestling with whatever demons drove him away from his daughter. Do you want me to step back? If I'm the liability? No. Victoria's answer came immediate and certain. That's what they want. What Dominic's lawyer will argue, that I prioritized an inappropriate relationship over Eva's welfare. If you leave, they win by default. Grace Chen entered with coffee nobody had requested but everyone needed. The board meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday. Marcus is bringing a motion to remove you as CEO. On what grounds? Compromise judgment, shareholder confidence, the usual corporate coup language. Grace set down the tray with more force than required. I'm sorry, Victoria. I should have seen this coming. 3 days later, photographs appeared online. Tabloid websites first, then picked up by financial blogs, finally landing on business news sites that pretended objectivity while trafficking in speculation. Victoria barefoot in some community garden Ethan had taken her to see where Sarah once volunteered. Victoria and Ethan's hands nearly touching. Victoria laughing, unguarded, human in ways that CEOs weren't supposed to be. Headlines ranged from suggestive to savage. From boardroom to bubbles, Sterling CEO's questionable judgment. Billionaire's breakdown. Is Victoria Sterling fit to lead? The Janitor and the CEO, a love story or corporate crisis? The comment sections were worse. Strangers with anonymous usernames dispensing judgment about people they'd never met, situations they couldn't understand, motivations they invented from whole cloth. Sterling Biotech stock dropped 8% in 2 days. Investors calling for explanations. Board members distancing themselves from Victoria's decisions while simultaneously claiming credit for the company's successes. Ethan's apartment became a target. Reporters camping outside, telephoto lenses pointed at windows, microphones shoved into Sophie's face when she walked to school. She handled it with more grace than any child should need, saying no comment, like she'd been trained by professionals, rather than just watching her father navigate the world with quiet dignity. The board meeting happened behind closed doors in a conference room designed to intimidate. 20 people with combined net worth exceeding several small nations gathered to decide whether the woman who'd built their fortunes was still useful or had become a liability to be managed. Marcus Webb called the meeting to order with parliamentary procedure and thinly veiled agenda. The motion: remove Victoria Sterling as chief executive officer, retain her as board member with minority shareholder status, install interim leadership until long-term succession planning could be finalized. Gregory Hammond presented the case. Declining stock price, shareholder concerns, media coverage creating reputational damage. The relationship with an employee, former employee technically, since Ethan had never been officially hired for Eva's care, raising questions about boundaries and judgment. Victoria had 15 minutes to respond. She stood at the head of the table where she'd sat for 15 years, commanding attention through sheer force of will that had nothing to do with the business suit she'd chosen like armor. I've spent 15 years building this company, closed deals you said were impossible, navigated regulatory challenges that would have destroyed lesser organizations, generated returns that made everyone in this room wealthier than you had any right to expect. Her voice carried the ice that had made competitors nervous and allies relieved. But the proudest moment of my career isn't on any quarterly report. It's watching my daughter say hope while painting a yellow sun because she finally felt safe enough to believe in something beyond silence. You're asking me to choose between the company and my child. I'm choosing my child. Fire me if protecting shareholder value requires sacrificing the only thing in my life that's actually growing. She walked out before they could vote, dignity intact even as power was systematically stripped away. The vote was 6-4 in favor of removal. Victoria learned the results from Grace, who'd stayed behind to witness the execution. Ethan was in the lobby when Victoria emerged from the elevator looking neither devastated nor relieved, just exhausted from carrying weight that had finally been lifted whether she'd wanted it gone or not. That afternoon, Ethan received the termination notice. Official this time, budget cuts necessitating workforce reduction. His position eliminated, security access revoked, final paycheck available from Human Resources upon return of all company property. Jim Porter shook his hand with the firmness of shared understanding between men who knew what honor looked like when institutions abandoned it. You got kids to feed. I got a buddy runs a grocery warehouse, night shift, pays $12 an hour, less than you're making now, but it's work. $12 an hour. Sophie needed new shoes. Rent was due in 10 days. The savings account that was supposed to be for college would buy maybe 3 months of time if he was careful. Ava regressed within 48 hours. No more eating voluntarily. Back to rocking in corners. The humming returned, distressed rather than soothing. Dr. Sharma's notes documented the decline with clinical precision that couldn't capture the desperation. Victoria tried continuing the techniques Ethan had taught, sitting on the floor, offering blue crayons, playing Debussy through speakers. But Eva wouldn't respond, wouldn't look at her mother, just stared at the window like waiting for something that wasn't coming. A week passed. Ethan worked the warehouse job, stocking shelves in refrigerated sections where breath formed clouds and fingers went numb. Sophie did homework in the car during his breaks, eating sandwiches that were breakfast and dinner combined because the budget no longer stretched to 3 meals. Victoria appeared at his apartment at 11 p.m. on a Friday, hair disheveled, makeup smeared, looking like someone who'd stopped pretending they had answers. They've frozen your access. They're threatening to have you arrested for trespassing if you come near the building. I told them I'd walk away from everything if they touched you again. They didn't care. Sophie emerged from her bedroom, sleep rumpled, but alert. Did Eva stop eating again? Victoria nodded, unable to speak past whatever was breaking in her throat. Maybe she's waiting for us. The suggestion came from a 9-year-old who'd learned that sometimes the solution to complex problems was refusing to accept they were complex. Victoria looked at Ethan with a question that was really a plea. We can't just show up. Legally, I'm a liability to your custody case. I don't care about legality. I care that my daughter is starving herself because we let other people's fears become our walls. They went. All 3 of them. After midnight, when security rotations changed and Jim Porter happened to be stationed at the service entrance, he looked at them, looked at the empty hallway, looked back at his monitor showing nothing of interest. Elevator's broken, probably be broken for about an hour. Maintenance should stay away until I can fix it, hypothetically. The penthouse was dark except for one light in Eva's room. Victoria had given them the access code, bypassing electronic records that would document their presence. Inside, Eva sat exactly where she'd been for hours, unchanged position, crayons scattered like abandoned weapons. Hey, Bluebird. Ethan's voice cut through the darkness, soft as landing. Eva's head lifted. 1 blink, 2, disbelief transitioning to fragile hope. He sat down, pulled a thermos from his jacket, soup he'd made from whatever was left in their kitchen. Nothing fancy, but warm and real. Sophie settled beside Eva without asking permission, holding out a glitter blue crayon like an offering to gods who might have forgotten their names. We missed you. Eva reached out slowly, took the crayon, drew a shaky circle on the floor with trembling fingers. Then she whispered, barely audible, cracked from disuse. Dinner again. Please. Victoria made a sound between sob and laugh, pure relief mixed with terror that this moment could be taken away again. She sank onto the bed's edge, watching her daughter choose connection over isolation, trust over fear. I'll never let them come between this again. Then we start building something they can't take away. Before Victoria could respond, the security alarm pierced the quiet. Not the subtle door sensor, The full building alert that meant someone in authority had been notified of unauthorized access. Gregory Hammond appeared in the doorway, flanked by two building security guards Ethan didn't recognize. Not Jim Porter's crew. Corporate reinforcements brought in specifically because local loyalty had become a liability. "I'm afraid you're trespassing, Mr. Cross." Eva's rocking started immediately, hands over ears, the bubble of safety shattered by voices too loud and intentions too sharp. Ethan stood slowly, positioning himself between Gregory and the girls. "The only danger here is you people treating a little girl like a PR problem. You've been dismissed from the premises. If you don't leave immediately, these officers will call the police." Gregory's smile never reached his eyes. "We're doing this for Miss Sterling's protection as much as yours." Sophie grabbed Ethan's hand, fear finally breaking through her practiced maturity. Evia began rocking violently, the meltdown triggered by raised voices and fractured peace. Victoria stepped forward, putting herself between Gregory and everyone else. Her voice carried the commanding tone that had once made boardrooms go silent. "Get out." "Excuse me? This is still my home. I may not be CEO, but you don't own my private residence. These people are my guests. You're trespassing." Gregory's expression flickered. Surprise meeting calculation. Recalibrating strategy. "The custody hearing is in 1 week. Do you really want to give Dominic's lawyers more ammunition?" "Let him come. Let everyone come. I'm done hiding." The security guards exchanged glances, uncertain whether corporate authority superseded property rights when those properties were penthouses owned by people who'd just been fired. Gregory read the room, recognized the loss, adjusted his approach. "You'll regret this decision." "I regret plenty. This won't be on the list." He left with the guards, footsteps echoing through marble hallways, leaving behind the debris of interrupted sanctuary. Victoria turned to Ethan and Sophie, voice shaking but resolved. "Stay tonight. I have guest rooms. Stay as long as you need. That's evidence for Dominic's case." "Then let it burn. I'd rather lose everything fighting than keep anything by running." They stayed, Sophie and Eva eventually falling asleep on the floor amid scattered crayons, Sophie's arm around Eva like protection or prayer. Ethan and Victoria sat in the kitchen drinking coffee that was too strong and talking about everything that had led them to this point where billionaires and janitors faced the same essential question: what was worth protecting when the cost was everything else? Across the city, in a law office that charged by the quarter hour in Victory, Dominic Sterling sat reviewing photographs his attorney had acquired. Night vision shots of Ethan and Sophie entering the building. Timestamps showing they'd stayed past midnight. Victoria's face visible through windows, looking at the janitor with something that could be misinterpreted as dependence or worse. His lawyer arranged the evidence in sequence, building a narrative that facts could support and emotional truth would contradict. "We won't even need to fight. She's destroying herself." Dominic stared at the photos, seeing his daughter for the first time in years, seeing her with people who'd accomplished what he couldn't. The triumph tasted like ash and necessity, the flavor of choices made for the right reasons that felt entirely wrong. "Prepare the filing, emergency hearing, request immediate custody transfer pending full evaluation." The lawyer smiled, sensing victory in the compensation that followed. Dominic looked away, unable to watch his own betrayal being celebrated. Part 3 revised, 5,500 to 5,600 words. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and ambition. Rebecca Torres, 45, wore a navy suit that suggested competence without flash, kept her desk organized with the precision of someone who'd learned that cases were won in preparation rather than performance. She spread the custody documents across the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. "This looks bad. CEO loses her position, brings unvetted man into home with vulnerable child, violates building security protocols." Rebecca's honesty was surgical rather than cruel. "Dominic's team will paint you as someone having a breakdown while his daughter suffers." Ethan sat next to Victoria, aware that his presence was simultaneously their strongest defense and most damaging liability. "Should I not testify?" "No, you're our best chance. Your special education background is documented. 11 years teaching gives you more frontline experience than most pediatric specialists." Rebecca turned to Sophie. "And you'll testify about what you've witnessed. Child testimony in family court is powerful when it's genuine. Sophie nodded with the seriousness of someone who understood that adult problems sometimes required children to become soldiers. Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she signed forms authorizing various invasions of privacy, medical records, financial disclosures, character witnesses who'd be asked to reduce her life to affidavits and declarations. The hearing was scheduled for Monday. 4 days to prepare for a battle where the weapon was truth and the terrain was interpretation. Dr. Sharma agreed to testify, though her hospital couldn't officially endorse methods that existed outside peer-reviewed literature. She brought Eva's medical charts spanning 2 years, cortisol levels, food intake logs, developmental assessments that documented regression followed by unexpected progress. The data speaks clearly. Eva's physiological markers improved dramatically during Mr. Cross's involvement. When that involvement was disrupted, she deteriorated. These aren't subjective observations. They're measurable responses documented in clinical records. Dr. Sharma's clinical detachment couldn't hide her frustration with systems that prioritize protocol over outcomes. Saturday afternoon, while Victoria and Rebecca rehearsed testimony in the penthouse's living room, Ethan found himself thinking about Dominic. Not the villain from legal documents, but the man behind the filing. He mentioned it to Victoria during a break when Rebecca was handling phone calls. "You said he has ADHD, that he told a therapist he felt like he was making Eva worse." "Yes, why?" "Because running from something you can't fix is different than not caring if it breaks." Victoria processed this, recognizing the parallel to Ethan's own story. He'd quit teaching for similar reasons. Fear disguised as practicality. Sometimes leaving was the coward's choice. Sometimes it was the only choice that felt survivable. Across town, Dominic sat in his own therapist's office, navigating guilt that had evolved from manageable regret into actionable crisis. Dr. Caroline Wu specialized in ADHD adults learning to function in worlds that punished distraction and rewarded sustained focus. She'd been Dominic's anchor for 3 years, watching him process the divorce, the financial collapse, the shame of being the father who disappeared. "Why do you want custody now, doctor?" Wu's questions never felt accusatory, just relentlessly honest. Dominic's answer came in fragments, confession assembled from pieces he'd been avoiding. "Half of me wants to prove I'm not the father who ran, that I can be what she needs. And the other half? The inheritance, 50 million when she turns 8. I'm broke, Caroline, completely underwater. I need this money. What does Eva need?" The question hung in air-conditioned silence. Dominic looked at photos his lawyer had provided. Eva with Sophie and Ethan, Eva drawing, Eva looking happier than any memory he could access from when he'd actually lived with her. "She needs me to have been different 4 years ago. Since I can't give her that, maybe she needs the money more than she needs me pretending I know how to be a father." Dr. Wu didn't respond immediately, letting Dominic hear his own words reflected back through silence. Family court lacked the drama of criminal proceedings. No jury box, no gallery packed with spectators. Just Judge Patricia Moreno presiding from a bench that emphasized authority through elevation, lawyers at tables separated by implications rather than physical distance, and witnesses waiting in hallways that smelled like institutional coffee and nervous sweat. Dominic arrived wearing a suit that broadcast expense without taste, accompanied by legal team that looked like they'd graduated from schools that had waiting lists for admission to their waiting lists. He avoided Victoria's eyes, focusing instead on documents that required studying despite having been memorized weeks ago. The opening arguments established battle lines. Dominic's attorney, Martin Crawford, 60, silver-tongued and expensive, presented a narrative of concerned father watching from distance as ex-wife's judgment deteriorated. "Ms. Sterling has lost her professional position, brought an unvetted individual, one with no clinical qualifications, into repeated unsupervised contact with a vulnerable child. She's ignored professional medical advice in favor of bubble games and crayon therapy." Scattered laughter from Dominic's side of the courtroom. Rebecca let it pass without objection. Sometimes letting opponents reveal their cruelty was more effective than challenging it. Rebecca's opening was surgical. "Eva Sterling has spoken for the first time in 2 years. She eats voluntarily. She engages socially. She draws herself into family pictures instead of isolated in corners. All of this happened not despite Mr. Cross's involvement, but because of it. While Mr. Sterling was absent for 4 years, never calling, never visiting, Mr. Cross was teaching Ava that the world could be safe enough to participate in. Victoria took the stand first, sworn in by a bailiff who'd administered the same oath hundreds of times to people whose lives were being reduced to admissible testimony. She wore the Navy suit but couldn't make it feel like armor anymore. That particular illusion had died in a boardroom vote. Rebecca led her through credentials: degree from Columbia, 15 years building sterling biotech, documented success that made her professional demolition even more stark. Miss Sterling, why did you involve Mr. Cross in your daughter's care? Because he accomplished in 15 minutes what 2 years of specialists couldn't. My daughter responded to him. She sat next to him. She picked up a crayon and started drawing. Victoria's voice remained steady, though her hands betrayed her with slight trembling. I've spent hundreds of thousands on therapists. I'd spend millions more if it helped. But Eva didn't need more credentials. She needed someone who understood that silence isn't failure. Crawford's cross-examination probed for weakness, like surgeon looking for cancer. You lost your position as CEO. Was that related to your involvement with Mr. Cross? The board felt my personal life was creating complications for shareholder value. So your judgment regarding Mr. Cross cost you your career? My choice to prioritize my daughter over quarterly earnings cost me a title. I don't consider that poor judgment. You've been photographed with Mr. Cross in what appear to be intimate circumstances. Are you involved romantically? Rebecca objected. Relevance? Judge Moreno sustained, but Crawford had planted the seed. Character assassination through implication, letting observers draw conclusions that facts didn't support. Dr. Sharma testified next, bringing medical objectivity to emotional terrain. Crawford tried to undermine her by emphasizing that Eva's progress happened outside standard treatment protocols. Doctor, do you endorse bubble therapy as legitimate treatment? I endorse results. Patient cortisol levels dropped 40%. Caloric intake normalized. Selective mutism showed measurable improvement. Dr. Sharma pulled out charts, data rendered into graphs that made progress undeniable. Conventional therapy had plateaued. Mr. Cross's approach, attachment-based intervention, documented in clinical literature, provided breakthrough when traditional methods didn't. But he has no medical license, no clinical credentials. He has 11 years teaching special education, more direct experience with sensory processing disorders than most pediatric specialists acquire in residency. Dr. Sharma's tone sharpened. The data is unambiguous. Patient deteriorated when Mr. Cross was removed from her environment. That's not opinion, it's documented physiological response. The courtroom absorbed this, implications settling like sediment. Ethan took the stand wearing the suit borrowed from Jim Porter's son, aware that every detail was being evaluated for signs of inadequacy. Crawford would paint him as opportunist. Rebecca needed him to be the teacher he'd been before grief made staying impossible. Mr. Cross, tell us about your background. I taught special education for 11 years in Colorado public schools, specialized in sensory processing disorders, autism spectrum, selective mutism, students who experience the world differently than standard curriculum assumed. The words came easier than expected, muscle memory from years standing before classrooms, explaining himself to skeptical parents. I left teaching when my wife died. Couldn't face the work when I'd failed at the most important version of it. You consider yourself a failure? I considered myself someone who'd abandoned his calling because staying hurt too much. Rebecca let that land before continuing. How did you approach working with Ava? I didn't treat her, I listened, matched her silence with stillness, created space where she could choose to engage without pressure. Ethan looked directly at Judge Moreno. Ava doesn't need fixing. She needs fewer people telling her she's broken. Crawford's cross-examination aimed for throat. You admit you abandoned your teaching career because you, quote, failed. I quit because I was grieving and children deserve better. And now you've attached yourself to another vulnerable child and her wealthy mother. Convenient timing given your financial situation. If I wanted money, I would have accepted Miss Sterling's initial offer to hire me. I work nights stocking groceries for $12 an hour. That's not someone chasing wealth. Crawford shifted tactics. When's the last time you saw Mr. Sterling look his daughter in the eye? Dominic's lawyer objected, but Ethan had already turned to face Dominic directly. When's the last time you looked at her at all? She was 3 when you left. She's 7 now, 4 years absent. But you think a title makes you her father? Judge Moreno warned about direct exchanges, but the damage was done. Dominic couldn't meet Ethan's gaze, couldn't defend absence with presence, couldn't argue that biology mattered more than staying. Being a parent isn't about who pays the bills. It's about who shows up when there's nothing to gain except the privilege of being needed. The courtroom took early lunch recess. Sophie waited in the hallway holding Eva's drawing, the 3 stick figures under stars, evidence rendered in crayon that no medical record could provide. When court resumed, Rebecca made an unusual request. Your Honor, Sophie Cross has asked to testify. She's 9 years old but has material observations about Eva's progress. Judge Moreno considered this, aware that child testimony carried risks of coaching and manipulation. But Sophie's demeanor suggested neither. She approached the stand with the careful dignity of someone who'd watched adults fail repeatedly and decided competence was her responsibility now. The bailiff brought a booster seat. Sophie sat, hands folded, meeting Judge Moreno's eyes with directness that suggested fear had been cataloged and overruled. Sophie, do you understand you're under oath? That means telling the truth even if it's hard. Yes, ma'am. Truth is the only thing that works. Lies just make problems take longer. Moreno's expression flickered, surprise or respect, hard to distinguish. You may proceed, Miss Torres. Rebecca kept it simple. Sophie, how often do you see Eva? We used to see her twice a week. Then people got scared we were helping wrong, so they tried to stop us. Now we see her when we can sneak past the people who think titles matter more than kindness. What have you noticed about Eva during the time you've known her? Sophie held up the drawing. Can I show something? Moreno nodded. Sophie left the stand, walked to the judge's bench with the careful steps of someone navigating territory where mistakes had consequences. She held up the picture. This is Eva's family. That's me. That's my dad. That's her. She drew this after dinner at her house. We ate pasta and nobody made her feel bad about eating slow. Crawford started to object about hearsay, but Sophie wasn't finished. Eva doesn't talk a lot, but she told me we're blue. That means safe. Like the ocean Dad says I've never seen, but will someday. Blue is when you can breathe without checking if it's allowed. She returned to the stand without prompting. Rebecca approached carefully, aware they were in territory where one wrong question could collapse the moment. What else have you observed? She used to only use blue crayons. Now she uses yellow too. Yellow is hope. She said that. Not to everyone, just to me when we were drawing stars. Sophie's voice carried the authority of someone reporting facts rather than interpreting meaning. Red is brave. She only started using red when her mom stopped being scared to sit on the floor. Crawford stood for cross-examination with visible reluctance. Attacking a 9-year-old carried risks even skilled lawyers hesitated to take. Sophie, do you know what Mr. Sterling looks like? No. Has Eva ever mentioned him? No, when I asked about her dad, she just drew gray, like fog, like something that used to be there but isn't anymore. What color do you think Mr. Sterling is to Eva? Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to math problems and grief alike. I think he's gray, because you can't see things that aren't there. The courtroom held collective breath. Crawford sat without further questions. Sometimes wisdom from children landed harder than evidence from experts. Eva, sitting beside Victoria in the gallery, reached out and touched Sophie's hand as she returned to her seat. Public touch, deliberate gesture, the kind of moment that courtroom transcripts couldn't capture, but everyone present would remember. Judge Moreno recessed for deliberation. 1 hour became 2. Lawyers made small talk with the forced casualness of people waiting for verdicts that would reshape lives regardless of outcome. When Moreno returned, her expression revealed nothing. Judges learned early to separate personal reaction from legal ruling, to make decisions that felt wrong serve purposes that were right. This is an unusual case, Mr. Sterling. Your absence is documented and troubling. Your motivation appears at least partially financial given the trust fund structure. While I believe you care for your daughter, I also believe you're motivated by factors beyond her best interest. Dominic's shoulders sagged fractionally. Surrender before the sentence was complete. Miss Sterling, your methods are unconventional. You've experienced significant professional setbacks, but Eva's medical records show undeniable progress during Mr. Cross's involvement. Progress that ceased when that involvement was interrupted. Victoria gripped Rebecca's hand hard enough to hurt. Custody remains with Victoria Sterling. However, Mr. Sterling will receive supervised visitation, 2 hours weekly, therapist present for 6 months. Mr. Cross's involvement will continue under Dr. Sharma's supervision with monthly progress reviews. Any further custody disputes require extensive psychological evaluation. The gavel fell with finality that echoed longer than sound should last. Victoria made a noise between sob and laugh, pure relief mixed with residual terror that victory could still be snatched back. Ethan pulled Sophie close, feeling her small body relax against him for the first time in weeks. Avuva whispered to Victoria, barely audible but clear enough, "Stay blue." Outside, paparazzi swarmed like predators who'd scented blood. Cameras flashing, microphones extended, questions shouted over each other in cacophony designed to provoke reaction rather than gather information. A reporter thrust a microphone into Victoria's face. "Ms. Sterling, are you in a relationship with the janitor?" Victoria stopped, turned to face the camera with the composure that losing everything had somehow returned to her. She looked at Ethan, then back at the lens. "I'm in a relationship with the truth, and he's been living it far longer than I have." Another reporter pressed forward. "What about your company? Will you fight to get your position back?" "I built Sterling Biotech from my father's failing research lab. 15 years of deals and decisions that made shareholders wealthy. But you want to know my proudest moment?" Her voice carried across the courthouse steps, reaching observers who hadn't planned to listen. "Watching my daughter paint hope in yellow. Hearing her say that blue means safe. That's worth more than any quarterly earnings report." Ethan guided Sophie and Eva through the crowd, using his body as shield against the press of bodies and demands. Victoria followed head high, walking away from cameras that would capture her departure as either defeat or liberation depending on which narrative sold better. Dominic watched from the courthouse entrance, alone despite being surrounded by legal team already discussing appeals and next steps. His lawyer outlined strategies, but Dominic wasn't listening. He was watching Eva hold Sophie's hand, watching her look back at him once with expression he couldn't read. Not hate, not love, just assessment of stranger wearing familiar DNA. The building that would become Cross Sterling Center sat on the edge of downtown, formerly storage for medical supplies nobody ordered. Victoria liquidated investments to fund the transformation. Blueprint sessions happened at Ethan's kitchen table because planning spaces designed for intimacy required intimacy itself. They sketched rooms with no assigned seating, sensory corners with controllable lighting, walls textured for children who learn through touch rather than sight. Sophie and Eva helped choose paint colors when contractors arrived. Blue base coat everywhere because some colors were foundations rather than decorations. Yellow accents appearing where Eva pointed. Her communication still happening through gesture and color more reliably than words. One afternoon during construction, Eva added a streak of yellow in corner nobody would see unless they were 7 years old and sitting on the floor. Ethan crouched beside her. "What's that?" Eva's voice came quiet but certain, each word chosen carefully. "Hope. For people who forgot, it's allowed." Dominic's supervised visits happened Wednesday afternoons in Dr. Wu's office. Awkward initially, loaded with the weight of 4 years' absence and custody battles accusations. But Eva attended because Judge Moreno required it, and Dominic appeared because shame and genuine desire were harder to separate than he'd expected. The first visit, Eva wouldn't look at him. Second visit, she accepted blue flowers he'd brought after Victoria mentioned Eva's color preferences. Third visit, she showed him a drawing. 4 people now, addition of 5th figure in corner. Gray, alone, uncertain. "Who's that?" Eva pointed at him without malice or judgment. "Just fact rendered in crayon." "Can I earn a different color?" She considered this with the seriousness inherited from her mother. "Maybe blue-gray, like sad but trying." By the sixth visit, Eva let Dominic sit on floor beside her while she drew. Not touching, not talking much, just existing in proximity that felt less dangerous each week. She added him to family drawing, still gray, but closer to the group, hand reaching toward theirs, though not quite connecting. Progress measured in inches rather than miles. The press conference happened 1 week before the center's opening. Victoria chose the site itself rather than corporate venue, standing in half-finished space surrounded by paint cans and possibility. Rain hammered against windows, appropriately dramatic backdrop for women who'd learned that storms eventually passed. Cameras assembled, reporters skeptical that this story had enough teeth to matter beyond slow news cycle. Victoria stood at makeshift podium wearing jeans and sweater that cost less than her former blazers, looking more human than powerful and somehow more memorable because of it. I've been asked by former board members, by PR consultants, by people who think titles matter more than truth, to explain myself, to explain why I let my daughter be seen, why I allowed someone without credentials to become the person she trusts most. She paused, letting rain fill the silence. I could give you carefully crafted statements designed to minimize liability, but I won't. The room leaned forward despite itself. I forgot what it meant to slow down, to see my child not as problem requiring solution, but as person deserving presence. I forgot that love doesn't need polish to matter. Her voice softened but remained audible. That man you wrote about, the janitor, he taught me something every executive forgets. You can't schedule breakthrough. You can't put metrics on intimacy. You can't quarterly report your way into your daughter's trust. A reporter raised hand. Are you stepping down from public life? I'm stepping up, not as CEO, as Eva's mother, as someone who finally understands that leadership isn't about being followed. It's about making space for others to walk beside you. And Mr. Cross, what's his role now? Victoria looked directly into camera lens. He's family, not employee, not consultant, not someone I hired. Family, the kind you choose when biology fails and titles don't matter, and all that remains is people who refuse to leave when leaving would be easier. The video went viral within hours. Not scandal viral, but human viral. The kind that made people forward it to friends with subject lines like, actually made me cry, and this is what real strength looks like. Comment sections filled with parents of children with special needs, sharing stories of specialists who treated symptoms while missing humans, of teachers who stayed when funding disappeared, of love that cost everything but paid in currencies that mattered more than money. Opening day arrived with autumn weather that made everything feel possible. Families gathered uncertain whether this center was real or just another program that promised inclusion while practicing polite segregation. But inside, the space spoke its own language. No one asked for diagnoses or treatment plans, just what music the child liked, what colors calmed them, what made them laugh when the world remembered to be kind. Ethan moved through rooms like conductor helping orchestra find its rhythm. Father struggling with overstimulated son learned to soften his hands, match breathing, let the child lead. Girl who hadn't spoken in school felt safe enough to hum, and humming became singing, and singing became permission for others to find their voices too. Sophie led group of children, drawing bubbles on windows using washable markers that would clean, but for now turn glass into stained glass stories. Eva sat on beanbag, 2 children joining her humming, creating harmony nobody had taught but everyone understood. Victoria stood in corner watching something impossible become ordinary. Ethan appeared beside her, observing their creation breathing without their permission. We built something that will outlast us. We built it together. You, me, Sophie, Eva. Every person who believes silence isn't failure. The ribbon cutting happened at noon, scheduled to accommodate children's routines rather than adult convenience. Rebecca Torres attended, having become friend rather than lawyer. Dr. Shah Sharma brought colleagues from the hospital. Jim Porter arrived in uniform, taking vacation day to witness victory he'd helped enable through selective blindness. Ethan insisted the children cut ribbon. Sophie and Eva holding scissors together. Rainbow-colored fabric spanning entrance like covenant between past and future. Before they cut, Eva turned to face gathered crowd with expression that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment. My name is Eva. I like colors. I like stars. Her voice carried further than volume alone should allow. This place is for anyone who felt like a puzzle piece in the wrong box. Silence. Then applause that started hesitant and built until it rattled windows and announced to neighborhood that something new existed here. Parents crying, children laughing, strangers becoming community through shared recognition that difference was variation rather than defect. Ava and Sophie cut ribbon together. It felt like shed skin, like barrier dissolving, like door opening onto rooms where belonging didn't require permission. Dominic watched from back row, still gray in Eva's color system, but present nonetheless. When Eva saw him, she waved. Small gesture, maybe habit, but acknowledgement that he existed in her world now. He waved back, throat tight with emotions that therapy had taught him to name but not control. That evening, 4 people gathered on the center's rooftop deck, a dish Victoria had insisted on because sometimes kids needed sky more than walls. Pizza from place that cut slices into small pieces, soda in cans that made satisfying clicks when opened, paper plates that nobody apologized for. City lights spread below like promises about futures that might actually deliver. Sophie asked the question she'd been holding. Do you think we'll always live near here? Victoria answered without hesitation. I think we'll always belong here. Eva leaned head against Ethan's shoulder, trust rendered physical. Home. He kissed her forehead, gesture that 5 months had transformed from deliberate to instinctive. That's exactly right. Victoria looked at 3 of them, Sophie, Eva, Ethan, and felt something unlock in chest she'd armored with degrees and deals and distance. I never knew love could be this quiet and still say everything. Ethan stood, joined her at railing overlooking city that contained multitudes of loneliness and connection, success and failure. People trying to figure out how to be human in a world that kept changing the requirements. You know the best part of this whole journey? Tell me. I came into your world thinking I had to teach you to kneel, that lowering yourself was the lesson, but somewhere along the way you learned something harder. What's that? How to stay, not because it was comfortable, but because it mattered. She touched his hand, feeling calluses that spoke of work unrelated to keyboards and conference calls. You didn't fix my daughter. You didn't fix me. You reminded us we were never broken. They kissed then, slow and earned, the kind of intimacy that came from shared trenches rather than shared interests. Sophie and Eva giggled in background, pleased by confirmation of thing they'd predicted months ago. Victoria pulled back, smiling. Is this okay with you two? Sophie rolled her eyes with exasperation only 9-year-olds could properly execute. Obviously, we've been waiting forever. Eva added her assessment, voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to speak only when words mattered. Finally, took so long. Laughter filled the rooftop, mixing with city sounds of traffic and distant sirens, and life refusing to pause just because moments felt perfect. They stayed until stars became visible through light pollution, until Eva yawned 3 times and Sophie's head drooped against Victoria's shoulder, until the pizza box was empty and the night air carried autumn's promise of change. Months later, in the community garden where Sarah had once volunteered, Victoria arranged for the city to revitalize the space. Donation made in Sarah's name because some debts were paid forward rather than backward. They gathered on a Sunday morning, all 5 of them now, Ethan, Victoria, Sophie, Eva, and Dominic, who'd earned his place through persistence rather than biology. Eva painted additions to the garden's mural, while Sophie directed the composition with the confidence of someone who understood that art required both vision and collaboration. Dominic planted flowers under Ethan's patient instruction, learning the rhythms of care that fatherhood demanded. Victoria stood slightly apart, one hand resting on her stomach where new life grew, secrets she'd shared with Ethan the night before, words whispered in darkness that felt like prayer. Eva added final touches to her mural, 6 figures now instead of 4, and above them a tiny yellow star that caught morning light and threw it back transformed. She stepped back to admire her work, then turned to the adults with expression that suggested she saw more than they'd realized. New hope, she said simply. And in those 2 words was everything they'd built and everything they'd become. Family, not through obligation but through choice. Love not despite complexity but because of it. Home, not as destination but as practice of showing up and staying even when staying was hard. They stood together in a garden that proved beautiful things could grow in soil that had been abandoned, then reclaimed, surrounded by flowers that bloomed without permission, and children who taught their parents that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be small enough to see what matters.